William Moore, known by most as just Will, was a man made by the land. He wasn't the type to trust many people, and life had taught him that staying independent was the best way to survive in the unforgiving Wild West. His ranch stretched across hundreds of acres, the vast desert landscape always offering a harsh beauty. Will had seen things, too many things, that made him believe the world was a place where only the strong could stand tall, and the rest either learned how to survive or perished in the dust. After his wife passed away many years ago, Will chose to live alone. It wasn't a lonely life, not really. The land kept him busy, but every now and then, when the wind howled through the mountains and the night seemed too quiet, he felt the weight of solitude press down on him like the heavy air before a storm. He'd always been a man of few words, but even the strongest men have moments where they wonder if they made the right choices. One evening, as Will was making his rounds on horseback, he noticed something odd. A small column of smoke rose in the distance not too far from his property. It wasn't the kind of smoke that comes from a campfire. It was too thick and dark. Without thinking, he nudged his horse toward it, curiosity tugging at him. As he neared, he saw a figure stumbling through the brush. It was a girl, no older than 18 or 19, wearing clothes that were torn and covered in dirt. Her face was smeared with blood, and she looked as if she had been through hell. She was dragging her feet, exhausted and hurt, and it was clear she had been walking for hours, maybe days. Will's heart tightened. He had lived through hard times, but this wasn't the kind of suffering that could be ignored. He approached slowly, calling out to her, "Hey there, are you all right?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. The girl didn't answer. She just kept walking, dragging her feet through the dirt. He could tell she was barely holding on. Will stopped his horse a few feet away from her. She didn't seem to notice him at first, her gaze lost in the distance. But then, as if sensing his presence, she stopped, looking up at him with wary eyes. Her face was a mask of dirt and pain. But even so, Will could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just anyone, she was strong. "I'm not here to harm you," Will said, trying to keep his voice calm. "You need help." The girl flinched, and for a moment Will thought she might bolt. But instead she took a few shaky steps toward him, then collapsed to her knees. It was all Will could do to dismount from his horse and catch her before she fell face first into the dirt. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to—" "Shh," Will said, easing her back against the horse. "You've been through a lot. You just need to rest." He had no idea who she was or where she came from, but one thing was clear. This girl was in no shape to be wandering alone in the desert. Will didn't ask any questions. It didn't matter at that moment. He just needed to get her somewhere safe. Will tied his horse to a nearby tree, then lifted the girl gently into his arms. She seemed to weigh next to nothing, and her body felt like it was made of brittle bones. He moved quickly, carrying her back to his small cabin. It was an effort. She was unconscious, and he had to maneuver around rocks and uneven ground. But Will was used to hard work. He wasn't going to let her die out here, not when he could do something about it. When he reached his cabin, he laid her down on his bed. He couldn't help but notice how delicate she looked lying there, like a bird that had been trapped in a storm, still trying to find its way back home. For a while he just sat beside her, watching her breathing. He'd been alone for so long that it felt strange to have someone else in his house, someone so vulnerable. He wasn't used to it, but something about the situation made him want to protect her. When the girl finally stirred, it was just before nightfall. Her eyes fluttered open and she blinked at Will in confusion. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice weak. "You're safe for now," Will replied, standing up. "You've been through a lot. Just rest." But the girl didn't seem to trust him. She sat up quickly, her hand flying to her side as if looking for something. "Where's my knife?" she demanded, her voice stronger now, more alert. Will raised his hands in surrender. "I don't have it." "You weren't armed when I found you?" She narrowed her eyes at him, sizing him up. Will didn't back down, but he could tell the girl wasn't someone who'd take easily to being cared for by a stranger. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his tone steady. "I found you out there and I brought you here to keep you safe." Her gaze softened just slightly, but she still didn't look at him with trust. It wasn't easy for her to let go of her defenses. He could tell she was used to being independent, to surviving on her own. "I didn't ask for help," she muttered, her head resting back against the pillow. Will sat down at the table across from her, still keeping his distance. He didn't know who she was, but he could tell she was different from anyone he'd ever met. There was something about the way she held herself, the way she looked at him, that made him feel like she didn't belong in a place like this. At least not as a victim. "You don't have to," Will said softly. "But you're not alone anymore. Not out here." She glanced at him, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Will could see the wariness in her expression, but he also saw a flicker of something else. A recognition, maybe. She was trying to figure him out, just as he was trying to understand her. She didn't say anything after that, and Will didn't push her. There would be time for questions later. For now, the only thing that mattered was getting her back on her feet. As the evening wore on and the night deepened, Will sat by the fire, his mind racing. Who was this girl? What had happened to her? But those questions would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was that she was here, alive, and hopefully, in time, she would trust him enough to tell him her story. The next morning, Will woke up early as usual. His cabin was quiet, save for the gentle sound of the wind outside and the faint crackling of the fire that still burned from last night. He had been used to silence for so long, but today it felt different. Today there was someone else in his space, someone who had, for all intents and purposes, been thrust into his life by chance, and yet somehow, she had become his responsibility. He had no idea what her name was yet, but she had told him in her sleep that she was Apache. He had heard of the Apache people, of course. The tales of their strength and their fierce resistance to outsiders were well known, and Will didn't exactly fit the mold of someone who would be welcomed by them. He knew that. But this girl, lying in his bed with the bruises and scars of someone who had seen far too much hardship, was not what he had expected. She wasn't the warrior woman the stories spoke of. She was fragile, broken, and lost. Will decided to make breakfast, the smell of cooking bacon filling the small cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The smell wafted to where she was lying on the bed, and Will noticed she stirred slightly, her eyes opening to the light of morning. The girl blinked, clearly confused, as if unsure of where she was. Her hand instinctively reached for the side of her bed, but then it froze. She didn't seem to know what to do. Will stood at the stove, watching her out of the corner of his eye. He didn't speak right away. He was waiting for her to make the next move. He didn't want to push her, didn't want to make her feel like a prisoner in his home. "Morning," he finally said, his voice quiet, almost respectful. "I've made breakfast if you're hungry." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at him with those sharp, alert eyes, almost studying him. Then slowly, she sat up on the edge of the bed, her body stiff from the pain. Will had noticed last night how sore she seemed, and he wondered just how far she had traveled before he had found her. "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice rough from disuse. She spoke like someone who was used to keeping quiet, and Will could tell that, like him, she wasn't one for too many words. But it also wasn't the voice of someone who was grateful for being rescued. It was a voice that still carried a sense of pride, a sense of strength. Will didn't take offense. He simply nodded and went back to his cooking. He could tell she wasn't ready to open up. People like her didn't trust easily. She was probably used to depending on no one but herself. When the bacon was done, Will set it on the table and walked over to where she was sitting. "I'm not going to force you," he said, his tone calm and steady. "But you should eat something. It'll help you heal." She didn't move at first, and for a moment Will thought she might ignore him entirely. But then, with a sharp sigh, she swung her legs off the side of the bed and slowly stood up, her body trembling from the effort. Will immediately moved closer as if to offer support, but she raised her hand to stop him. "I can stand on my own," she said firmly, though it was clear she was struggling to keep her balance. There was a quiet defiance in her words, a challenge to his kindness that he recognized immediately. "All right," Will replied, stepping back, "but don't push yourself too hard." She didn't acknowledge him, but slowly she made her way over to the table. She sat down cautiously, as though every movement hurt her body. But she still managed to sit up straight, her back stiff with that same pride that had been in her voice earlier. She reached for the food without a word, her fingers shaking slightly, but she ate in silence. Will watched her for a moment, noticing how she chewed slowly, almost thoughtfully, as though every bite was a conscious decision. It was the kind of carefulness you saw in people who had been through far more than anyone should. Will didn't know what had happened to her, but he knew enough to understand that she wasn't some helpless girl to be coddled. She had a strength that most people would never know. After breakfast, Will left her alone for a while, giving her the space she needed. He had no idea how long she had been on the run, how many dangers she had faced. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that she was probably used to being alone. In the Wild West, people like her didn't rely on anyone. They couldn't afford to. Later in the afternoon, he returned to check on her. She was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Will couldn't tell if she was lost in thought or if she was just too tired to care about anything else. He cleared his throat, not wanting to startle her. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. She glanced up at him, but there was no smile in her eyes. She didn't seem angry or even upset, just tired. So tired, as if the weight of the world had been resting on her for far too long. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice distant. "I just need to go." Will's heart sank at the words. He had been expecting them, but it didn't make them any easier to hear. He had known from the start that she wouldn't stay. She wasn't the type to settle in one place, not when the world was so full of danger for someone like her. "You can't leave yet," Will said firmly. "You're not well enough to go anywhere." "I don't need your help," she replied, her tone sharp. There was that defiance again, the fierce independence that seemed to run through her blood. Will didn't argue. He had learned long ago that you couldn't force someone to stay if they didn't want to. But he also knew that if she left now, there was a good chance she wouldn't survive the journey alone. "I'm not asking you to stay for me," he said quietly, his voice steady but kind. "I'm asking you to stay for yourself." She met his gaze then, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a brief moment, Will saw something flicker in her. A flash of uncertainty, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had come, and she simply turned her gaze back to the fire. "I don't need saving," she said softly, more to herself than to Will. "I can take care of myself." Will knew she wasn't ready to admit the truth, that she did need help, that even the strongest person needed someone to rely on at times, but he wasn't going to push her. "Not yet, I know," he said gently, "but sometimes it's okay to let someone help." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she stood up slowly, as if the decision had already been made in her mind. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said, her words final. "I won't stay here." Will didn't try to stop her. He just nodded, understanding that her journey was one she had to take alone. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Something that would bind them together even if she didn't realize it yet. The next morning, Will could feel the tension in the air as he watched the girl, Ayana, move around the cabin. She had told him the night before that she would leave, but there was something about her that made him wonder if she was truly ready. Her eyes were clouded with determination, but he could see a faint trace of hesitation, like she wasn't fully convinced by her own words. Will had seen people like her before, people who tried to act tough, who carried a shield of pride around them like armor, not realizing that it only made them more vulnerable. He knew she wasn't ready to leave, not yet. But he also understood that forcing her to stay wasn't the answer. She had to make that choice herself. Ayana was sitting by the fire when Will finally spoke up, his voice low but clear. "I'm not going to stop you from leaving if that's what you want. But you're not well enough. You should rest another day at least." She didn't look at him. Instead, she continued poking at the fire with a stick, the flames crackling softly. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Will had grown used to the quiet, but this was different. There was an unspoken weight in the air, a distance between them that neither seemed willing to cross. "I'm not staying," Ayana said, her voice firm, but there was a tremble in it, just the smallest hint of uncertainty that Will caught immediately. "I know," Will replied quietly, not pushing her. He understood why she felt this way. He could see how hard it was for her to accept help, to trust anyone enough to let them in. "But sometimes the hardest thing is letting someone care for you." She glanced at him, her expression hard, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something more, something like vulnerability. "I don't need anyone," she said, her words clipped, but not as confident as they had been the day before. Will wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed either. He just felt something deep in his chest, a mixture of understanding and something else, something he wasn't quite ready to name. "Maybe not. But there's no harm in letting someone help when they offer. Doesn't make you weak." Ayana's lips pressed together into a thin line, and she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the small table, clearly trying to distract herself. She grabbed a piece of cloth and began to wrap it around her arms, as if she was preparing for something. Will could see that she was trying to hide her emotions behind her actions, but he knew better. He had seen this kind of behavior before in people who tried to bury their pain under layers of pride and defiance. "I'll manage," she muttered, her back to him now. "I'm not staying here any longer." Will watched her for a moment, trying to figure out what to say. He had learned long ago that some people just needed time to process things on their own. He had learned that the hard way. There was no point in pushing her, but he also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she wasn't telling him everything, that there was more to her story than she was willing to share. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady, though his heart felt heavy. "But I'm not going to let you leave until you're strong enough. That's the deal." She didn't respond, but Will could see the faintest nod in the way her shoulders relaxed just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the rest of the day, they didn't talk much. Ayanna seemed lost in her thoughts, and Will, for his part, gave her the space she needed. He spent the day working around the cabin, doing little chores here and there, checking the fences, making sure the animals were fed. His mind kept wandering back to her. She was unlike anyone he had met before. There was a quiet strength about her, something that made him respect her even when she seemed determined to push him away. As evening fell and the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, Will made them both dinner. The simple meal was enough to fill them both, but there was something heavy in the air, something unspoken. Will had no idea what would happen when Ayanna was ready to leave, but he knew he couldn't force her. He couldn't make her stay if she didn't want to. After they ate, Will sat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Ayanna sat a little distance away, her back against the wall, her eyes distant. Will didn't look at her directly, but he could feel the weight of her presence. It was as though she was still trying to decide if she could trust him or not, and that uncertainty hung in the air between them like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Ayanna spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I didn't ask for your help." Will glanced at her, but he didn't respond immediately. He just let her speak, knowing she needed to say it. "I know you didn't," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "But I couldn't just leave you out there. You were in no shape to be on your own." She was silent for a long moment, and Will could see that she was thinking carefully about his words. She seemed torn, like she wanted to say more but wasn't sure if she could. Eventually she looked up at him, her eyes locking onto his. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice low but laced with curiosity. There was no anger in her tone now, just a quiet confusion, as if she couldn't understand why someone like him would care for someone like her. Will shrugged slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't know. Maybe it's because you're not just some helpless girl. You're strong." "I can see that." Ayanna didn't look away. She didn't say anything more either. It was like her words had been taken away, and for the first time Will saw the mask she had been wearing begin to crack just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Will to see that she was no longer as sure of herself as she had been before. They sat there for a while, the fire crackling between them. There was no rush to fill the silence. It was comfortable in a way. It felt like a moment of understanding, like something had shifted between them. When Ayanna finally spoke again, it wasn't to argue. It wasn't to push him away. It was a simple, quiet admission. "I don't know what to do anymore." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Will didn't say anything right away, but inside he felt something stir. He didn't know what had happened to her, didn't know the full story. But whatever it was, it had left deep scars on her heart, and somehow Will felt that maybe, just maybe, he could help her heal. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Will said quietly. "You don't have to do anything except take care of yourself. And when you're ready, you can go. But you're not alone." For the first time, Ayanna didn't protest. She didn't try to push him away or make herself stronger than she felt. Instead, she simply nodded, a small, subtle shift in her expression, as though she was beginning to accept the truth of his words. And for the first time, Will allowed himself to believe that she might actually stay long enough to heal. The days passed slowly at Will's cabin. The weather was changing, the nights growing cooler, and Ayanna was beginning to regain her strength. She still moved with caution, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. She no longer flinched when Will offered her a hand or when he asked if she needed help. Instead, she accepted his assistance when she needed it, though she never showed any gratitude. It wasn't that she was unappreciative. It was more that she wasn't used to relying on anyone. It was a difficult thing for her to do, and Will understood that. It had been 2 weeks since she had arrived at the cabin. In those 2 weeks, Will had learned more about Ayanna than she had intended to share. She had told him bits and pieces of her story. Never too much, always just enough to hint at the struggles she had faced. She spoke of her tribe, of the raids, and the constant fight for survival. But she never spoke about the pain, the things that had broken her. Will didn't push. He knew better than to rush her. One morning, Ayanna had been standing by the fire, staring into the flames, when she turned to Will. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes held something Will hadn't seen in her before. "I can't stay here forever," she said, her voice calm but firm. Will didn't look up from his work, but he felt the weight of her words. He had known this moment was coming. He had been waiting for it, even though part of him had hoped it wouldn't. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet companionship they had found in each other's company. But he knew that she had her own path to follow, her own journey to finish. "I never said you had to," Will replied, keeping his tone neutral. "But you're not ready to leave yet. You're still healing." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the mountains in the distance. It was clear that the idea of leaving was something that was eating away at her, something she couldn't shake. Will could see it in the way her hands clenched by her sides, the way she stood there, rigid and unmoving. "I can't stay here forever," she repeated, a little louder this time, more insistent. Will put down the tool he had been working with and finally met her gaze. He had been patient with her, but he couldn't let her go without saying what needed to be said. "You don't have to stay here forever, Ayanna," he said softly, "but you can stay until you're ready. You don't have to fight this on your own. Not anymore." For a long moment she said nothing. The wind rustled the trees around them, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Will stood there waiting, unsure of what to say next. It wasn't his place to tell her what she should do, but he couldn't help feeling like he needed to offer some kind of comfort. He had seen what she was like when she didn't let anyone in, when she kept everything locked up tight. He didn't want her to leave in that same broken state. Finally, Ayanna spoke again, her voice softer now, tinged with something that might have been regret. Or maybe just the exhaustion of carrying her pain for so long. "I've never been good at trusting people," she admitted, her eyes dropping to the ground. "I've always had to rely on myself. I don't know how to let anyone help." Will's heart softened at her words. He knew the feeling all too well. The weight of isolation, the fear of letting someone else in, of opening yourself up to the possibility of being hurt again. He had spent years burying his own pain, unwilling to let anyone see the scars that ran deeper than the ones on his skin. "I get it," Will said gently, his voice steady. "But you don't have to do everything alone, Ayanna. It's okay to let someone care about you." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the edge of the cabin, her posture tense, her eyes still on the mountains. Will stayed where he was, waiting for her to make the next move. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Will raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You're not like the other men I've met. You don't want anything from me. You just help." Will nodded slowly, taking in her words. He wasn't sure what she meant by the others, but he knew that she had seen things. Things that had made her distrust people, especially men. Will had never been one to take advantage of someone's vulnerability, though. He had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. "I'm not asking for anything in return, Ayanna," he said firmly. "I just want to make sure you're safe. You're not just some stranger to me. You're someone who's been through a lot, and if I can help you, I will." Ayanna's eyes searched his face as though trying to find the truth in his words. For a moment, the silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. Will could feel the weight of her gaze, the vulnerability in her eyes. It was as if she was finally starting to believe that she didn't have to carry everything on her own. That maybe, just maybe, she could let someone else in. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," she said quietly, almost to herself. Will took a step toward her, his voice soft. "Trust doesn't happen overnight, Ayanna, but it's a start. You don't have to rush it. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since she had arrived, Ayanna seemed to relax just a little. Her shoulders, which had been so rigid with tension, softened slightly. She still wasn't ready to let go of everything, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. A flicker of hope, maybe, or maybe just the smallest crack in the wall she had built around herself. Will stood there, giving her space, not wanting to push her any further. He knew that she was still processing everything, still trying to figure out who she could trust. But he also knew that for the first time, she wasn't trying to push him away. She wasn't shutting him out. "You don't have to leave yet," Will said again, his tone gentle. "You can stay as long as you need to. But when you're ready, we'll figure it out together." Ayanna didn't answer, but the way she looked at him was different now. It was as if she had finally heard what he had been trying to say all along. There was no rush. She didn't have to carry her pain alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe that someone could care about her without expecting anything in return. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land, Will felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He didn't know what the future held for him and Ayanna, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in the world. And that, he realized, was enough. Ayanna had spent several days thinking about what Will had said to her. The quiet moments around the fire, the soft conversations over meals, each one had begun to build a sense of peace inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the comfort of the cabin or the warmth of the food. It was something deeper, something about Will's way of being, so steady and calm, made her question the walls she had built around herself. It made her wonder if it was time to stop running, to stop fighting against everything and everyone. But still, she wasn't sure. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the kindness Will had shown her. It was that part of her, the part that had been shaped by years of hardship, still couldn't quite let go of the fear. The fear that trusting someone meant opening herself up to hurt, to being vulnerable in ways that felt dangerous. The morning sun shone brightly over the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. Will was already up and moving around the cabin, busy with his usual chores. Ayanna had started to help out more, feeding the animals, gathering wood for the fire, but she kept to herself, her mind racing with the thought of what came next. She knew she couldn't stay forever. She had her people to return to, her tribe to find, even if it meant facing danger once again. But the thought of leaving the safety of Will's cabin felt like an impossible task. It wasn't just about leaving the comfort of the place, it was about leaving him. "I'm not ready to leave yet," she said one morning as she helped Will with the horses. Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of something uncertain in it, something Will hadn't heard from her before. Will paused for a moment, glancing up at her. There was a slight change in her expression, her eyes softer, her body more relaxed, as though she had let go of something heavy. "I know," Will said gently, brushing a bit of dirt off his hands. "You don't have to leave if you're not ready. You can stay as long as you need to." Ayanna nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt behind her eyes. "I don't know what to do next." Will didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his attention to the horses, focusing on the task in front of him. He wasn't going to pressure her. She needed time, and time was something he had plenty of. It wasn't just about getting her back to health. It was about giving her space to heal emotionally, too. And that, Will knew, would take time. For the next few days, there was a shift in the air between them. It wasn't just about the work they did together or the quiet meals they shared. It was the little moments that added up, like the way Ayanna would occasionally catch his eye when she thought he wasn't looking, or the way she started to linger longer by the fire at night, no longer rushing off to bed as soon as she could. It wasn't much, but it was progress. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in deep oranges and reds, Will sat on the porch with Ayanna, watching the last light of day fade into night. The air had grown cooler, and the wind rustled gently through the trees. They sat in silence for a while, each of them lost in their thoughts. For Will, it was a rare moment of peace. For Ayanna, it was something she wasn't used to, a sense of stillness, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to be at rest for once in her life. "I never thought I'd find peace here," Ayanna said softly, breaking the silence. Will looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Peace is hard to come by, especially in a place like this. But sometimes it's not about finding peace, it's about learning how to live with what you've been through." Ayanna nodded, staring into the fading light. There was something in her posture now, something softer than before. The walls she had built around herself were still there, but they were beginning to crumble bit by bit. I don't know if I'll ever stop running, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But for the first time, I'm not sure I want to. Will didn't answer right away. He didn't have all the answers for her, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to push her. She had to decide what her path would be, but he could give her something no one else had, an understanding that there was no shame in taking a moment to breathe, to heal. You don't have to decide anything today, he said, his voice steady. You can stay as long as you need to, and when you're ready, we'll figure it out. Ayanna met his gaze then, her eyes full of something like gratitude, though she didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. She was learning, slowly but surely, that it was okay to rely on someone, that it was okay to stop running even if only for a little while. The next morning, Ayanna helped Will with the horses again. She worked alongside him without hesitation, her movements more fluid, more sure. The pain in her body had eased, but it was the pain in her heart that still lingered, still kept her from truly believing that she could belong anywhere, that she could be part of something again. You're getting stronger, Will said, his voice carrying across the barnyard as he tightened the last of the horse's saddle. Ayanna paused for a moment, glancing at him. Maybe, she said, but there was a trace of a smile on her lips. But it's not just my body that needs healing. Will nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. That takes time, he said quietly. And it's not something anyone else can do for you. But when you're ready, you'll know. Later that day, as they sat down to eat together, Ayanna finally spoke again, her voice calm but resolute. I'm going to go, she said, looking at him directly. Not today, but soon. I have to find my people. I can't stay here forever. Will didn't argue. He had known this day would come. But he wasn't sad. He wasn't angry. He simply nodded. I understand, he said, his voice steady. You'll know when you're ready. Ayanna looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, something she hadn't noticed before. It was a quiet respect, a deep understanding. Will hadn't asked her to stay. He hadn't tried to change her. He had simply offered her a place to heal, a place to breathe. And for the first time, Ayanna realized that maybe she didn't have to be alone in this world. Maybe, just maybe, there were people out there who understood the kind of strength it took to survive, but who also understood the value of letting go when the time was right. As she looked out at the land before her, the setting sun casting its golden light over the horizon, Ayanna knew one thing for certain: she wasn't running anymore. And when she left, it wouldn't be because she was afraid. It would be because she was ready to face whatever came next, with the strength of someone who had learned how to trust, how to heal, and how to live again.